My name is Dora. Sitting here in my condo, which is finally back in my name, I can't help but recall the nightmare that unfolded just a few weeks ago. It was a betrayal that shattered my trust in my family and made me realize that sometimes, you have to fight for what's yours, even if it's against the people you love the most. I remember waking up in the hospital after a long and grueling spinal fusion surgery. My mouth was as dry as sandpaper, and my body felt like it had been hit by a truck. A kind nurse checked my vitals, told me the surgery had gone well, and asked if I wanted my phone. I nodded, still groggy, expecting a simple text from my boss or a get-well message from a coworker. Little did I know that my world was about to come crashing down. When I saw the 73 missed calls on my phone, my heart skipped a beat. Most of the calls were from my mother, a dozen from my father, a few from my sister Lily, and a couple from numbers I didn't recognize. My first thought was that something had happened to my beloved grandmother, who had been in and out of the hospital for months. With a heavy heart, I pressed play on the voicemail my father had left 3 hours after my surgery started. His voice was calm, almost too calm. It was as if he was reading off a grocery list, not telling me that he and my mother had sold my condo. "Dora, honey, it's Dad. Listen, we know this is bad timing, but we didn't have a choice. We sold your condo. We needed the money for Lily's wedding. You know how expensive everything got. The venue backed out, and the caterer doubled their price. You were out cold, so your mother and I signed the papers for you. Don't worry, everything's handled. We'll explain when you're feeling better." I played the voicemail 3 times, hoping that I had misheard, that it was all a terrible mistake. But the words sank in, and I felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over me. My condo, the one I had worked so hard for, the one I had saved every spare dollar for, the one I had renovated myself, was gone. $425,000, just like that. While I was lying on an operating table, unable to say a single word, unable to object, unable to even know what was happening. The nurse must have noticed the look on my face because she asked if I was in pain. I lied and told her I was fine, but inside, I was seething. I asked for a moment alone, and once she stepped out, I called my mother. She picked up on the first ring, her voice bright and rushed, already talking about flower arrangements before I could even say hello. When I finally got a word in and asked her flatly how they had access to sign anything on my condo, she paused and then said the words that would haunt me for weeks. "You gave your father power of attorney for the surgery, sweetheart. In case anything happened. We just used it a little more broadly than you probably meant. A little more broadly." That was the phrase she used for stealing my home. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back, my hands trembling against the hospital blanket. The power of attorney had been for medical decisions only, signed weeks earlier at my father's insistence. He had said it was just a precaution, in case you can't speak for yourself during the operation. I remembered him sliding the paper across the kitchen table so casually, like it was nothing, like it wasn't a door he was quietly leaving open for himself. Lily's wedding was in 3 weeks, and I hadn't even been given a real say in the planning. I was just expected to show up, smile, and pay for a designer dress I couldn't afford. Now I understood why my mother had been so insistent I signed that form before the surgery. This wasn't an emergency decision made in a panic. This had been planned. Despite the pain and the throbbing in my incision, I asked the nurse for my laptop bag, which my neighbor had dropped off along with a change of clothes. My hands were unsteady, and my vision was still a little blurry from the medication, but I opened my email and found the number of someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 4 years. A real estate attorney named Elise Reed, who I had met when I first bought my condo. She specialized in property fraud and elder exploitation cases, and I never imagined I'd be the one needing her for something like this. With shaking fingers, I typed out an email, attaching a photo of the power of attorney document I still had saved from my files, and explaining everything as clearly as my foggy brain allowed. Then I made one phone call, my throat tight, my voice barely above a whisper, asking Elise if what my parents did was even legal. Her answer was immediate, and it was not what my parents expected to hear. Elise didn't waste time with sympathy or small talk, which I appreciated more than she probably realized. She asked me to forward the power of attorney document immediately, and within an hour, she called back, her voice sharp and businesslike. "Dora, this document explicitly limits authority to medical decisions during your surgery. There is no language granting financial or property authority. What your parents did isn't a gray area. It's forgery, and depending on how the sale was structured, it could also be fraud." I sat there in my hospital bed, the words settling into me slowly, the same way the anesthesia had worn off hours earlier, layer by layer, until I felt everything at once. She asked if I wanted to pursue this quietly through a demand letter, or whether I wanted to go further. I thought about the calm, rehearsed tone in my father's voicemail, how he had said, "We didn't have a choice," like he was talking about a broken appliance and not my home. I thought about my mother's phrase, "a little more broadly than you probably meant," delivered without a shred of guilt. 3 weeks until Lily's wedding, funded by the sale of my condo, and not one person had thought to ask me first. I told Elise I wanted everything documented, and I wanted it done right. By the next morning, still recovering, barely able to shuffle to the bathroom without gripping the 4-pole, I had a plan in motion. Elise filed an emergency motion challenging the validity of the sale, citing the limited scope of the power of attorney and requesting an immediate freeze on the transferred funds. As it turned out, the funds hadn't fully cleared yet because of a title contingency. That detail alone gave us a narrow window. The buyer's closing funds were sitting in escrow, waiting on a signature verification step that hadn't been completed. And Elise argued that step could not legally proceed given the fraudulent authorization. My father called that afternoon, his voice no longer calm. He said the escrow company had contacted him asking about a legal hold and wanted to know what I'd done. I told him exactly what I'd done, that I'd hired an attorney, that the sale was being challenged as fraudulent, and that if he wanted to avoid a formal police report for forgery, he needed to reverse everything immediately. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that told me he finally understood I wasn't the same daughter who used to apologize for things that weren't her fault just to keep the peace. My mother tried a different approach. She called twice, sending messages about how selfish I was being, how Lily had already sent invitations referencing the venue paid for with family support, and how I was going to ruin everything 3 weeks before the wedding by making a scene. I didn't respond to the messages. I let Elise handle the communication from that point on because every time I tried to explain myself to my mother, I ended up feeling like I was the one who had done something wrong. I was done carrying guilt that wasn't mine. 2 days later, the escrow company froze the transaction pending review exactly as Elise had hoped. The buyer, unwilling to get tangled in a fraud dispute, backed out entirely. My condo, at least on paper, was still mine. But the money my parents had already pulled out for wedding deposits, nearly $60,000 paid to the venue and caterer before the full sale even closed, was gone, spent, non-refundable. My father had to go to the venue himself and explain there had been a legal complication. I heard from my aunt that the conversation did not go well, that the venue coordinator asked pointed questions about whose name was actually on the original contract, and that my father left looking like a man who had aged 5 years in 5 minutes. Lily called me eventually, not to apologize, but to ask if there was any way I'd let this go so the wedding could still happen as planned. I told her gently but firmly that this had never been about her wedding. It was about the fact that our parents had signed away my home while I was under anesthesia and hadn't shown a single moment of hesitation doing it. I told her I hoped her wedding still happened, just not built on something taken from me without my knowledge. In the weeks that followed, my parents were required to formally acknowledge the invalid transfer, and the title was fully restored to my name. There was no big dramatic courtroom scene, no headline moment, just quiet paperwork undoing quiet theft. But something inside my family shifted permanently. My father stopped calling as often. My mother sent one final message, calling me ungrateful, and I didn't reply. I healed slowly, both my spine and whatever version of me used to believe family meant automatic trust. If you've ever had people closest to you cross a line you never thought they'd cross, I hope this story reminds you that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. If this story moved you, hit subscribe because there are so many more stories like mine still coming, and I don't want you to miss a single one.